Hello, my dearest listeners, and welcome back to Whispers in the Gloom. Tonight, we journey to a place where beauty and tragedy are intertwined, where secrets are cultivated like night-blooming flowers in a forgotten garden. Before we delve into this tale of crimson secrets and veiled intentions, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you for your continued support. Every listen, every comment, and every subscription allows me to continue bringing these shadows to light. If you enjoy these journeys into the darkness, please consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the notification bell. Truly helps more than you know. And now, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to uncover the secrets of the Scarlet Deviless behind closed doors. The carriage wheels groaned in a relentless chorus of protest, churning through the thick, cloying mud of the Essex countryside. Each lurch and shudder was a physical manifestation of Eleanor Vance's departure from the familiar, gaslit certainty of London. Inside, she clutched the worn leather of her satchel, her knuckles a bloodless white against the dark material. She was a journalist, a title she had fought tooth and nail for in a world dominated by men who saw her as little more than a novelty. And now, she was on the trail of a story that could either cement her reputation or shatter it entirely. The enigma of Lady Seraphina, a woman whispered about in hushed, fearful tones in every drawing room and public house, the Scarlet Deviless of Blackwood Manor. The whispers had begun as a trickle and grown into a flood over the past year. They spoke of a woman of almost supernatural beauty, a siren who lured men of fortune and title to their doom. The narrative was as seductive as it was horrifying. There was Lord Ashworth, a man known for his robust health and booming laugh, who had withered away, succumbing to a sudden violent illness that baffled the finest physicians. Then came the dashing Captain Montgomery, a celebrated war hero, found broken at the bottom of a ravine, his prize stallion standing placidly nearby, a detail that screamed of foul play. The latest and most dramatic was the elderly, immensely wealthy Duke of Clarence. His London townhouse had been consumed by a ferocious fire, a blaze from which Lady Seraphina had emerged, framed by the inferno, miraculously unscathed and tragically widowed once more. The gossip columns, penned with sanctimonious glee by her male rivals like the insufferable Abernathy of the Daily Chronicle, painted a lurid picture. They depicted a black widow, a modern-day Circe, spinning webs of desire and death, her motives as transparent as her supposed grief was false. Yet, for all the ink spilled and reputation slandered, not a single shred of concrete evidence had ever been brought against her. The law remained powerless, the whispers her only accusers. It was this discrepancy that had ignited Eleanor's journalistic instincts. She thrived on the stories that lay between the lines, the truths hidden in the shadows of public opinion. With a boldness that surprised even herself, she had written directly to Lady Seraphina, bypassing the usual channels, requesting a series of exclusive interviews to pen an authorized biography. It was a long shot, a wild gamble. To her utter astonishment, a reply had come within a fortnight. The stationery was heavy cream, the handwriting an elegant, flowing script. It contained a single, startling word: accepted. As the carriage finally broke free of the oppressive, tangled woods, Blackwood Manor materialized from the twilight mist. It was a formidable sight, a Gothic masterpiece of jagged turrets and snarling gargoyles that clawed at a bruised, purple sky. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something terrible in. A single light burned in a high, narrow window, a lonely, defiant beacon in the vast, dark facade. A sense of profound unease, colder and sharper than the autumn wind, prickled at the back of Eleanor's neck. This was not just a house. It was a mausoleum of secrets. The carriage drew to a halt before a pair of imposing oak doors, banded with iron that had rusted to the color of dried blood. As if summoned by their arrival, the doors swung inward with a low groan, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit hall. A woman stood waiting, a figure of starched severity. She was dressed in a severe black dress, her graying hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, giving her an expression of perpetual disapproval. Her eyes, small, dark, and intelligent, missed nothing. "Miss Vance, I presume," she said, her voice as crisp and devoid of warmth as the chilled air in the hall. "I am Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper. Her ladyship is expecting you." Eleanor murmured her thanks and followed the housekeeper through a labyrinth of grand, yet profoundly gloomy, corridors. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and something else, something cloying and faintly medicinal that she couldn't quite place. Towering portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes rendered with unsettling realism, stared down at her from the walls. Their painted gazes seemed to follow her every move, a silent, spectral jury. The silence of the manor was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket broken only by the rhythmic, metronomic tap of Mrs. Albright's sensible shoes on the polished floorboards. It was a silence that felt curated, enforced. Finally, they reached a set of carved mahogany doors at the end of a long hallway. Mrs. Albright knocked once, a sharp, decisive rap that echoed in the stillness. A soft, melodic voice from within bid them enter. The room was a startling contrast to the oppressive gloom of the rest of the manor. It was a library, 2 stories high, filled with the warmth of a crackling fire in a cavernous hearth. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, their leather-bound spines a kaleidoscope of color, a testament to generations of learning and leisure. And there, in a high-backed armchair upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, sat Lady Seraphina. If the papers had called her beautiful, they had done her a grave injustice. Beautiful was too simple a word. She was ethereal. Her hair was the color of spun gold, piled high on her head in an intricate coiffure that seemed to defy gravity. Her eyes, the color of summer violets, were large and expressive, but shadowed by a weariness that went beyond her years. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk, a bold, almost defiant color that should have been shocking but on her seemed as natural as the petals of a rose. She offered a small, sad smile that did not quite reach her haunted eyes. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice a low, melodic murmur that seemed to fill the room. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. I trust your journey was not too arduous." Eleanor, momentarily disarmed by the woman's presence, a strange mix of fragility and strength, quickly composed herself, remembering the professional purpose of her visit. "Lady Seraphina, thank you for agreeing to see me. I must confess, your acceptance of my request was a surprise." "I am a woman of many surprises, Miss Vance," she replied, her gaze unwavering, holding Eleanor's with a discomfiting intensity. "And I have grown weary of the stories, the whispers that paint me as a monster. Perhaps it is time the world heard my version of events. Or perhaps I am simply lonely." Over the next few days, Eleanor found herself drawn into the strange, somber rhythm of life at Blackwood Manor. The interviews were held each evening in the library, the only room in the house that seemed to hold any genuine warmth. Seraphina was a captivating storyteller, recounting a lonely childhood in a remote Scottish castle, a life filled with books and governesses but devoid of friendship. She spoke of her first love, a penniless young artist who had died of consumption, and the profound, all-consuming grief that had followed. She spoke of her subsequent marriages with a strange, detached air, as if describing the plots of novels she had once read. Eleanor listened, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook. She was a skilled interviewer, adept at probing for inconsistencies, at asking the questions that peeled back the layers of a carefully constructed narrative. But with Seraphina, it was like trying to grasp smoke. Her answers were always plausible, her emotions always meticulously controlled. She was a fortress of poise and sorrow. The other inhabitants of the manor were equally enigmatic. Mrs. Albright ran the household with an iron fist, her loyalty to Lady Seraphina absolute and unnerving. She regarded Eleanor with a thinly veiled suspicion, her beady eyes observing every interaction, every question. Then there was Mr. Graves, the groundskeeper, a hulking, silent man with a face like a thundercloud and hands the size of shovels. He seemed to communicate only in grunts and monosyllables, his looming presence a constant, unsettling shadow on the periphery of Eleanor's vision as she took her daily walks. It was on one of these walks, seeking a respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the manor, that she found it. The gardens were a tangled, neglected wilderness, a ghost of their former glory. She stumbled upon a small, forgotten cemetery, half hidden by a grove of ancient, weeping yews. Most of the headstones were old and weathered, their inscriptions rendered illegible by time and lichen. But one stood out, stark and new, carved from pristine white marble. It bore a single name, Annalise, and a single date from the previous year. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced, Eleanor broached the subject. "I found a grave in the garden today," she said, her tone deliberately casual. Annalise, a family member. For the first time since Eleanor's arrival, Lady Seraphina's perfect composure seemed to crack. A flicker of something raw and unidentifiable fear, sorrow, perhaps even anger flashed across her face before she quickly masked it with her usual placid expression. "She was my sister," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My twin." This was a revelation, a bombshell. None of the society papers, none of the extensive research Eleanor had done, had ever mentioned a sister. "I had no idea," Eleanor said, her journalistic instincts now screaming. "What happened to her?" Lady Seraphina rose from her chair and walked to the tall, mullioned window, her back to Eleanor. The crimson of her dress was a stark slash of color against the encroaching darkness outside. "It is a painful story, Miss Vance," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "One I am not yet ready to tell." That night, sleep offered Eleanor no peace. She was awakened by a sound, a faint, mournful melody drifting through the silent corridors of the manor. It was a piano, played with a delicate, almost ghostly touch, a melody of heartbreaking beauty and profound sadness. She crept out of her room, the candle in her hand casting long, dancing shadows. She followed the sound down the cold, drafty hallway to a closed door in the disused west wing. The music was coming from within. She pressed her ear to the cold wood, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The next morning, at breakfast, she mentioned the late-night recital to Mrs. Albright, who was serving her a plate of kedgeree with rigid formality. The housekeeper's face, already a mask of disapproval, seemed to harden into granite. "You must have been dreaming, Miss Vance," she said, her tone cold and final, leaving no room for argument. "There is no piano in this house. It was sold for scrap years ago." Eleanor knew she had not been dreaming. The music had been real as the cold knot of fear that was now tightening in her stomach. The secrets of Blackwood Manor, she was beginning to realize, were far deeper and darker than she could ever have imagined. The story of the Scarlet Deviless was not just a tale of seduction and greed. It was a tragedy of secrets and lies, a symphony of sorrow played on a phantom piano behind closed doors. Her quest for the truth had taken a perilous turn, and she had a chilling premonition that the final, devastating crescendo was yet to come. The twin revelations, the existence of a deceased twin sister, and the phantom melody from a non-existent piano had fundamentally altered the landscape of Eleanor's investigation. Her initial journalistic detachment had dissolved, replaced by a more personal, almost obsessive, curiosity. The Scarlet Deviless was no longer just a sensational headline to be captured and pinned to a page. She was a woman of flesh and blood, a woman haunted by a past that was as much a prisoner of Blackwood Manor as she was. The house itself seemed to be a co-conspirator, holding its breath, guarding its secrets. Eleanor knew that direct confrontation with Seraphina would yield nothing but more artful deflections. She had to approach the mystery from its periphery. She began to observe the manor's other inhabitants with a new, heightened intensity. She attempted to engage Mrs. Albright in conversation, complimenting the running of the household, hoping a little flattery might loosen her tongue. But the woman was a fortress of starched linen and steely resolve. Her loyalty to her mistress was a palpable, unnerving force. Her answers to Eleanor's carefully worded questions about the family's history were curt, non-committal, and often ended with a sharp, "That is not your concern, Miss Vance." Mr. Graves, the groundskeeper, proved to be an even more difficult enigma. Eleanor would find him in the gardens, his massive frame bent over a patch of weeds, his movements slow and deliberate. She tried to talk to him about the gardens, about the history of the estate, but he communicated only in grunts and reluctant nods. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that his silence was not one of ignorance, but of a deliberate, almost fearful reticence. One afternoon, she saw him standing by Annalise's grave, his cap in his hands, his broad shoulders slumped. He stood there for a long time, a statue of silent grief, before noticing her and shuffling away, his face a thundercloud of apprehension. He was grieving, but for whom and why the fear? Frustrated by these human walls, Eleanor turned her attention to the house itself. If people wouldn't speak, perhaps the rooms would. She felt an irresistible pull towards the west wing, the source of the ghostly music. Mrs. Albright had forbidden her from entering it, claiming it was structurally unsound, but this only fueled Eleanor's determination. One rainy afternoon, when the housekeeper was in the village on an errand, Eleanor slipped away. The west wing was a world away from the meticulously maintained gloom of the rest of the house. Dust sheets, like ghostly shrouds, covered the furniture. The air was thick with the smell of damp, decay, and forgotten things. Peeling wallpaper depicted faded pastoral scenes, and cobwebs as thick as cotton hung in the corners. It was a place where time had stopped. It was here, in a small, forgotten sitting room, that she found it. Tucked away in the back of a large, cedar-lined wardrobe, beneath a pile of moth-eaten linens, she found a small, leather-bound diary. The embossed gold lettering on the cover was faded but legible. Annalise. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the voice from beyond the grave. With trembling hands, she opened the diary. The handwriting was delicate and feminine, a stark contrast to the dark, foreboding atmosphere of the room. The initial entries were filled with the melancholic musings of a sensitive young woman living in the shadow of her more beautiful, more vivacious twin. Annalise wrote of her love for music. Her secret compositions played on an old, out-of-tune piano in this very Winga piano that Mrs. Albright had insisted did not exist. She wrote of her unrequited love for a young man from the village, a stable hand named Thomas, whose head had been turned by Seraphina's dazzling charm. As Eleanor read on, the tone of the diary grew darker, more desperate. Annalise's entries chronicled a pattern of subtle cruelty and psychological torment. She wrote of Seraphina borrowing her most treasured possessions and returning them broken, of mocking her shyness in front of guests, of twisting her words to make her seem foolish. The jealousy was a poison, seeping into every page. Then came the final entries. They were written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. Annalise described a terrible argument with Seraphina over Thomas. She called me a pale, pathetic shadow, Annalise wrote. She said I deserved to be alone. When I told her I would tell father about her sneaking out at night, her eyes changed. I have never seen such coldness, such rage in a human soul. It was not my sister I saw in that moment, but a stranger. The very last entry was short and chilling. She knows I have this diary. She wants it. I fear what she is capable of. I fear for my life. The diary sent an icy shiver down Eleanor's spine. It was a piece of the puzzle, a crucial one, but it painted a picture of Seraphina that was far more monstrous than even the gossip columns had dared to suggest. What had happened to Annalise? How had she died? And what role had the beautiful, sorrowful Seraphina played in her demise? That evening, during her scheduled interview, the library's warmth felt like a sham, its crackling fire a mockery of the cold dread that had settled in Eleanor's heart. She decided to take a calculated risk. I've been exploring the West Wing, she said, her voice a carefully constructed neutral tone. It's a beautiful part of the house. It's a shame it's fallen into such disrepair. I found the old piano. It must have been wonderful to hear it played. She watched Seraphina closely, looking for any reaction. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, an almost imperceptible tightening around her perfect mouth, a flicker in the depths of her violet eyes. The West Wing holds too many painful memories, she said. her voice soft and tinged with a familiar sadness. "It was my sister's part of the house." "Annalise," Eleanor said, letting the name hang in the air between them like an accusation. Seraphina's mask of serene composure finally slipped, shattering like fine porcelain. Her eyes, usually so calm and collected, were now wide with a raw, unguarded emotion. "What do you know of my sister?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "I know she played the piano," Eleanor said, pressing her advantage, her gaze unwavering. "I know she was in love with a young man named Thomas. And I know she was afraid of you. Terribly afraid." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the fire. When Seraphina finally spoke, her voice was hoarse with an emotion Eleanor couldn't decipher. "You have been reading her diary." It was not a question, but a statement of defeat. Eleanor did not deny it. Seraphina rose from her chair, her movements stiff and unnatural, and walked to the window, her silhouette a dark shape against the rain-streaked glass. "Annalise was fragile," she said, her voice filled with a strange mixture of tenderness and resentment. "She lived in a world of her own making, a world of sad music and impossible dreams. She did not understand the realities of our world, the compromises one must make to survive." She turned to face Eleanor, her eyes now blazing with an intensity that was almost frightening. "You think you have uncovered a dark secret, Miss Vance. You think you have found the truth in the scribblings of a sad, jealous girl. But you know nothing, nothing at all." Before Eleanor could respond, Seraphina swept out of the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the echoing words and 1,000 unanswered questions. The interview, it seemed, was over. That night, the storm that had been brewing all day finally broke with biblical fury. The wind howled around the manor like a tormented spirit, and the rain lashed against the windows in violent sheets. Eleanor lay in bed, unable to sleep, her mind a whirlwind of diary entries, veiled threats, and haunting piano music. The house groaned and shuddered around her, as if in agony. Sometime after midnight, she was jolted from a light, uneasy doze by a loud crash from downstairs, a sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. It was too sharp, too violent to be the storm. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. Slipping out of bed, she lit a candle and crept out into the hallway, the cold floorboards shocking her bare feet. The manor was plunged in an inky darkness, the air cold and still despite the raging storm. She made her way downstairs, her small flame pushing back the oppressive shadows. The sound had come from the library. As she approached, she saw a faint, erratic light flickering from under the door. Pushing it open, she froze, a gasp catching in her throat. The library was in a state of chaos. Books had been torn from the shelves, their pages rifled through. Papers were scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, a section of the ornate wall paneling was swung open, revealing a small, hidden safe, its door now hanging ajar, empty. And lying on the priceless Persian rug, in a rapidly spreading pool of blood, was the hulking form of Mr. Graves, the groundskeeper. A heavy, ornate letter opener from the desk was clutched in his hand, though it was clear the fatal wound was in his back. A scream rose in Eleanor's throat, but it was choked off by a sudden movement in the shadows near the fireplace. A figure emerged, a woman in a dark, hooded cloak. She held a small, leather-bound book in her hand. It was Annalise's diary. "You should not have come here, Miss Vance," the woman said, her voice a low, menacing whisper. It was a voice Eleanor recognized instantly, a voice that sent a shard of ice through her veins. It was the voice of Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, but it was stripped of its crisp formality, now laden with a cold, ruthless edge that had not been there before. Before Eleanor could react, a second figure emerged from the shadows behind the large desk. It was Lady Seraphina. She was deathly pale, trembling from head to foot, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. "Agnes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What have you done?" Mrs. Albright turned to her mistress, and a cruel, triumphant smile twisted her thin lips. "I have done what was necessary, my lady," she said, her gaze possessive and chilling. "Just as I have always done." And then, in a moment of horrifying, sickening clarity, Eleanor understood. The whispers, the rumors, the Scarlet Deviless, it had all been a lie. Not just a lie, but a brilliant, carefully constructed facade to hide a much darker, much more twisted truth. The story was not about a seductive enchantress who murdered her suitors for their wealth. It was about this woman, this terrifying, obsessive servant, who would stop at nothing to protect her mistress, to preserve the terrible secrets that lay buried within the very walls of Blackwood Manor. The scene in the library was a tableau of Gothic horror brought to life. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the maelstrom of secrets and violence that had been unleashed within. Mr. Graves lay dead, a silent, tragic testament to the dark undercurrents that had been flowing beneath the surface of this somber household for years. Mrs. Albright stood over him, her posture rigid with a chilling lack of remorse. Annalise's diary clutched in her hand like a holy text, and Lady Seraphina, the infamous Scarlet Deviless, seemed to have collapsed in on herself, a fragile, trembling doll in the face of the storm her housekeeper had unleashed in her name. "What is the meaning of this?" Eleanor demanded, her voice shaking but laced with a newfound resolve forged in adrenaline and outrage. She would not be intimidated. This was no longer just a story. It was a crime scene, and she was the only witness. Mrs. Albright turned her cold, beady eyes on Eleanor. The deference of the servant was gone, replaced by the arrogance of a predator. "The meaning, Miss Vance," she said, her voice dripping with scorn, "is that you have stuck your journalistic nose into a story that is not yours to tell. Some doors are best left unopened." "Mr. Graves found you," Eleanor pressed on, her mind racing, piecing together the horrifying puzzle. "He found you trying to steal the diary from the safe. He knew, didn't he? He knew what really happened to Annalise. He tried to stop you, and you killed him." "He was a sentimental old fool," Mrs. Albright sneered, casting a dismissive glance at the dead man. "His loyalty was misplaced. He thought to protect the family's name by burying the past. I understand that the past must be curated, controlled." "And you," Eleanor said, her gaze shifting to the terrified Seraphina, "you knew about all of this. You've known all along what she was capable of." A sob escaped Seraphina's lips, and she covered her face with her hands. I didn't know what to do," she whispered, her voice broken. "She has always been with me, since we were girls. She has always taken care of things." And then, the confession, not from the killer but from her prisoner, began to unravel. It was a story that had begun not with Seraphina's first wealthy suitor, but decades before, in the lonely, isolated nursery of Blackwood Manor. It was a story of two sisters, one praised for her dazzling beauty, the other for her quiet obedience. It was a story of jealousy, of a deep-seated resentment that had festered in the heart of the less favored sister, Annalise. But it was also the story of a third person, a young housemaid named Agnes Albright, who had been assigned to care for the two girls. Plain, ambitious, and resentful of her own station in life, she had latched onto the beautiful Seraphina, seeing in her a vessel for her own thwarted ambitions. She doted on her, protected her, and lived vicariously through her triumphs. Conversely, she had despised the quiet, withdrawn Annalise, seeing her as a flaw, a pale imitation of her radiant sister. As the years passed, Agnes's devotion to Seraphina had mutated into a twisted, obsessive form of protection. She saw threats where there were none, and she dealt with them with a ruthless efficiency that belied her humble station. When Annalise's infatuation with the stable hand, Thomas, threatened to cause a scandal, Agnes had seen it as a betrayal. She confronted Annalise in the West Wing. In the ensuing struggle over the diary, Annalise had stumbled, falling backward, her head striking the hard stone corner of the fireplace. It had been an accident, a moment of violence with a tragic, unforeseen consequence. But Agnes, in her twisted mind, saw it as a necessary evil. And Seraphina, a terrified young woman, was manipulated into a pact of silence. The secret of that day became the chain that bound her to Agnes, now the indispensable Mrs. Albright, for the rest of her life. The deaths of Seraphina's suitors had followed a similar, horrifying pattern. Mrs. Albright, seeing each man as a potential threat to her control over Seraphina, had eliminated them one by one. Lord Ashworth had not died of a sudden illness, but of a slow, steady administration of arsenic, disguised in his nightly glass of port. Captain Montgomery's horse had not been randomly spooked. Mrs. Albright had coerced the lovelorn Mr. Graves to rig a tripwire across the narrow bridle path. And the fire that had killed the Duke of Clarence had been no accident. It was a carefully planned act of arson, orchestrated by the woman who had appointed herself as Seraphina's guardian angel, protector, and executioner. Seraphina was not a black widow. She was a gilded hostage, her life a prison built by her keeper's bloody hands. "You see, Miss Vance," Mrs. Albright said, her voice now chillingly calm. "Her ladyship is a delicate creature. She is not equipped to deal with the unpleasantries of life. I have merely been protecting her interests, ensuring her comfort and security." "You are a murderer," Eleanor breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and disgust. Mrs. Albright simply smiled, a thin, humorless line. "I am a loyal servant," she corrected her. "And now I am afraid you have become a most serious unpleasantry." She took a purposeful step towards Eleanor, raising the bloody letter opener. But before she could take another, a loud, authoritative voice rang out from the doorway. "That's far enough, Mrs. Albright. Drop the weapon." It was the local constable, a stout, determined man Eleanor had met briefly in the village. He was flanked by two of his men, their faces grim and set in the flickering lamplight. Relief washed over Eleanor, so potent that her knees almost buckled. She had done one more thing that afternoon after reading the diary. Overcome by a sense of foreboding, she had scribbled a hasty, urgent note to the constable, expressing her grave concerns and requesting he make a welfare check at the manor that evening. She had paid a stable boy a handsome sum to deliver it immediately. She had not known if it would arrive in time. Mrs. Albright, however, seemed unfazed by the arrival of the law. She looked from the constable to Eleanor, and then her gaze settled on the trembling, weeping figure of Lady Seraphina. A look of final, tragic understanding passed between the housekeeper and her mistress, the final act of a lifetime of toxic codependency. This was the end of her control, the end of their secret world. Then, in a move as swift as it was shocking, Mrs. Albright turned the letter opener on herself, plunging it deep into her own chest with a guttural cry. She crumpled to the floor without another sound, her lifeblood staining the pages of the diary she still clutched in her hand. The crimson curtain had fallen on the tragic opera of Blackwood Manor. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Scarlet Deviless was eclipsed by the even more sensational and true tale of the demon housekeeper. The newspapers, led by a humbled Mr. Abernathy, were filled with lurid headlines and speculative articles. But Eleanor, the journalist who had broken the story, chose to write a different kind of narrative. Her articles, published as a series in a respected London periodical, were not about monsters. They were a nuanced, compassionate exploration of the corrosive nature of secrets, the destructive power of obsession, and the tragic consequences of a life lived in the shadow of another. She wrote of two sisters, bound by blood but torn apart by a society that valued one's beauty over the other's heart. She wrote of a woman whose loyalty had twisted into a monstrous, possessive love, born from the bitter soil of class resentment. And she wrote a scathing critique of a society all too quick to condemn a beautiful woman, to mistake her silence for guilt, to create a monster where there was only a victim trapped in a gilded cage. Lady Seraphina, cleared of all suspicion but forever haunted by the scandal, sold Blackwood Manor and its contents. She retired to a quiet, secluded villa in the south of France, never to be seen in society again. She was finally free, but at an unimaginable cost. Eleanor Vance, on the other hand, became a household name. Her series on the Blackwood Manor case won her a prestigious award and established her as one of the country's foremost investigative journalists, shattering the glass ceiling she had been hammering against for years. But she never forgot the lessons she had learned within the dark, oppressive walls of that Gothic mansion. She had gone in search of a simple monster, a Scarlet Deviless of popular imagination. But she had found something far more complex, far more tragic, and, in the end, far more human. She had found a story not of a devil, but of the devils we create in our own hearts and homes, the monsters that are born not in the shadows, but in the dark, hidden corners of love, jealousy, and despair. And it was a story that would stay with her for the rest of her life, a chilling reminder that the most terrifying secrets are always the ones hidden behind closed doors.